The rain poured down in cold, heavy sheets, drenching Cheryl's hoodie as she crouched in the shadows of a dimly lit alley. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. 3 years on the streets had taught her how to survive, but tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't stealing for herself. She was stealing for Joan. Her 15-year-old sister was getting worse. The pneumonia was tearing through her small body, and the doctor at the shelter had warned them. Without medicine, without a warm place to recover, Joan wouldn't make it. Cheryl couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. That's why she was here, watching a man in an expensive suit fumble with his briefcase under a flickering streetlight. His shoes alone probably cost more than she had seen in years. A billionaire? Maybe. The kind of man who wouldn't even notice if a few $100s went missing. His wallet, thick, promising, peeked out from his coat pocket. Cheryl's grip tightened around the glass shard wrapped in cloth, her makeshift weapon. She wasn't going to hurt him, she just needed to be quick. Slip in, grab the wallet, disappear. It was her only chance. She took a slow, quiet breath and stepped forward. Then, everything changed. The man staggered, clutching his chest, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. His briefcase fell, papers scattering into the puddles. His wallet landed inches from her boots. Cheryl's heart pounded. This was it. She could just take it and run. But then his eyes met hers, wide, desperate, pleading. "Help!" he wheezed, barely able to speak. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to take the money and disappear into the night. But instead, her hands moved before her mind could stop them. She grabbed his phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed emergency services, her voice cutting through. The storm, man down, alley off 5th. Minutes felt like hours. Sirens finally wailed through the rain, flashing lights bouncing off the wet pavement. Paramedics swarmed around him, lifting his pale, unconscious body onto a stretcher. Cheryl stood frozen, soaked and shivering, her mind racing. She had a choice: walk away, pretend this never happened. But instead, her legs carried her forward, following them to the hospital. She didn't know why. Maybe because he was still clutching her wrist when he lost consciousness. Maybe because, for the first time in years, someone had looked at her like she was more than just a girl on the streets. Or maybe because, deep down, she knew this night wasn't over yet. And she was right. Because when he woke up, the first words he spoke would change everything. Cheryl sat in the hospital waiting area, her damp hoodie clinging to her skin, her legs bouncing with restless energy. She wasn't supposed to be here. She should have taken the wallet and disappeared into the night, bought Joan's medicine, and never looked back. But instead, she had followed the ambulance, standing awkwardly as doctors rushed the billionaire through the ER doors. Now she was stuck in this too bright, too clean space, surrounded by strangers who belonged here far more than she did. The receptionist had already thrown her a few suspicious glances, as if she could tell Cheryl wasn't the type to have insurance or a stable address. She pulled her hood lower, her fingers curling into the fabric of her sleeves. Then, a nurse stepped out, scanning the room before locking eyes with Cheryl. "He's awake," she said. "He asked for you." Cheryl's stomach twisted. Why? What could he possibly want from her? She wasn't even sure why she had stayed, but now it felt too late to turn back. Taking a steadying breath, she pushed herself up and followed the nurse down the hallway. Inside the hospital room, the billionaire looked pale but alive. Wires and monitors surrounded him, beeping softly. His blue eyes found hers immediately, still a little hazy but sharp enough to hold her in place. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough. Cheryl shifted uncomfortably. "You were dying in the street. I just called for help." "That's more than most people would have done." He studied her, like he was trying to figure her out. Then his gaze dropped to her hoodie, the damp fabric still clinging to her arms. "You don't look like someone who just happened to be passing by." She hesitated, her instinct to lie kicking in. But she was too tired for that now. "I was gonna steal your wallet," she admitted, voice quiet. "I needed the money." His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes. Not anger, not even surprise. Just understanding. For yourself? He asked. No. She swallowed. For my sister. She's sick. She needs medicine, and I don't have another way to get it. Silence stretched between them, heavy with something Cheryl couldn't name. Then, finally, he nodded. What's her name? Joan. He exhaled, running a tired hand over his face. All right, Cheryl, take me to her. Her head snapped up. What? I want to see her, he said simply. If she's as sick as you say, she shouldn't be in a shelter. Cheryl's body tensed. This was too much. Too fast. Rich people didn't just help street kids. They walked past them, ignored them, pretended they didn't exist. And yet, here he was, offering something that felt dangerously close to hope. I don't even know you, she said, her voice hardening. He held out a weak hand. Raymond Voss. Cheryl didn't shake it. I don't trust you. A small, tired smile tugged at the corner of his lips. That's fair. But I can help. If you let me. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to run. But Joan's face flashed in her mind. Pale, fevered, struggling to breathe. Cheryl had fought for so long to keep her safe, but she was running, out of time. Against every ounce of caution she had left, she nodded. All right, she muttered. But if you try anything, I'm gone. Raymond chuckled, though it sounded more like a cough. Deal. An hour later, Cheryl led him through the shelter's back entrance, her heart pounding with every step. This was the only home she and Joan had left. If this went wrong, if Raymond was lying or playing some rich man's game, she had nowhere else to turn. But when he saw Joan, her frail body curled up in a pile of thin blankets, her breathing shallow, something in his face cracked. She's worse than you said, he murmured. No one listens when you're homeless, Cheryl whispered. Raymond straightened. Not anymore. She's coming with me. Cheryl stiffened. She's not going anywhere with a stranger. I won't be a stranger for long, he said. You both need help. And I'm not leaving her here. Cheryl opened her mouth to argue, but Joan let out a weak, rattling cough, her body shaking. The decision was already made. Moments later, Raymond was making a call, and within an hour they were in the back of a sleek black car, heading toward a life Cheryl never imagined. What she didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Because the past had a way of catching up. And secrets, especially the ones people thought were buried, never stayed hidden forever. Cheryl sat beside Joan in the back of the sleek car, her fingers tightly gripping her sister's small, cold hand. Raymond sat across from them, his phone buzzing with constant messages, but he barely glanced at it. His focus stayed on Joan, on her labored breathing, on the way Cheryl kept nervously checking her pulse. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but Cheryl's mind was too restless to take them in. She had spent years fighting to survive, dodging trouble, stealing only when she had no other choice. And now, in one night, everything had changed. They pulled up to a massive estate, nothing like the shelters or rundown buildings Cheryl had known. The moment they stepped out, a team of doctors was already waiting. Joan was rushed inside, and for the first time in years, Cheryl felt utterly powerless. Hours passed in a daze. Cheryl paced the marble floors, resisting the urge to bolt. She didn't belong here. But when the doctor finally emerged with an update, her heart nearly stopped. She'll be okay, he said. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but we've stabilized her. She just needs rest and proper care. Cheryl sagged against the wall, her breath coming out in a shudder. Relief hit her so hard she almost cried, but she forced herself to keep it together. Raymond, watching her, finally spoke. Finally, you don't have to run anymore. Cheryl looked at him sharply. What's that supposed to mean? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I know more about you than you think. I had my team look into it. You've been on the streets since you were 15, bouncing from shelter to shelter, taking care of your sister on your own. Cheryl stiffened, her body tensing like a cornered animal. You had no right. I had every right, he interrupted gently. Because I know what it's like to be abandoned by the world, and I know that no one makes it out alone. She narrowed her eyes. You don't know anything about me. A long silence stretched between them before he finally said, You're right. But I do know that you're not a thief. You're just someone who had to do whatever it took to survive. Cheryl swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. Raymond leaned forward, his expression serious. I want to help you, Cheryl. Not just for Joan. For you. The words unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. No one had ever said that to her before. Help was always conditional, always temporary. But as she looked at Joan, sleeping peacefully, for the first time in weeks, she knew she couldn't keep running forever. She met Raymond's gaze, hesitating for only a moment before nodding. And just like that, everything changed. Months later, Cheryl stood on the balcony of the estate, watching, as Joan played in the massive garden below. She still had a hard time believing this was real. Raymond had done more than just save Joan's life. He had given them a home, a chance at something more than just surviving. She had started working at one of his charities, helping other kids, like her, ones who had slipped through the cracks of the system. It wasn't easy trusting people after so many years of struggle, but for the first time, she felt like she had a future. Raymond joined her, leaning against the railing. You're different now, he said. Cheryl smirked. Yeah, well, turns out, having food and a bed changes a person, he chuckled, shaking his head. No, it's more than that. You're finally living, Cheryl. She looked at Joan, laughing, as she chased butterflies, and for the first time in her life, she believed it. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally found their way home.